In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to make a custom swipe gesture for list-like items in SwiftUI. I have an example of this on the simulator on the left. If I swipe to the right, then you can see that there's content on the left which I can interact with. And if I swipe to the left, there's content on the right which I can interact with. I won't be showing you how to make this exact example today, but I will be showing you how to make the functionality behind it. And the first thing that you need to do is to declare a struct called swipeItem, which conforms to the View protocol so that it has a body computer property. Let's place a placeholder in there for now. Next, we want to pass in content to the swipe item. And there are three different types of content that we have. We have the left content, the middle content, and the right content. And we don't know what these content are going to be until we pass in those into the swipe item when we create them. So we need to use generics. And I'm going to list those up here. So content, the content type refers to the middle content, left refers to the left, and right refers to the right. Now, we need a way to store these in our struct, the content that's passed in order to use them. So I'm going to declare three different local properties that just store these closures of content for us. And it's pretty self-explanatory. So content left and right. And additionally, I'm going to add a local property that keeps track of how tall the swipe item should be. And that would be called item height. The initializer for this struct is pretty simple. All it does is it uses ViewBuilder to pass in content of the left, right, and middle. And it sets those local properties that we defined to the content that we passed in. So you can pause the video here to copy that down if you need time. Next, now that we have our content, we can put that in the body. So I'm going to use an H stack with spacing 0 to put the left, the middle, and the right in. For the left and right, I'm going to add two modifiers. The first is a z index of 1, and the second is a clipped modifier. And the reason I'm doing this is because in case the left and right grow past the size that they were designated, this will make it look a little better, though it won't totally fix it. Now we can focus on the swipe functionality of our swipe item. The way that we're going to do that is through a drag gesture. So I'm going to declare a computer property called drag that has an opaque type of some gesture. And I'm going to place a drag gesture in there. Let's apply that to our H stack. For our swipe functionality, we have quite a few variables that we need to define. The first two are the most important, but obviously all of them are necessary. So we have something called an H offset, which stands for horizontal offset. And it keeps track of how much we swipe horizontally. Next we have an anchor. And this anchor value tells us where we are locking into place. So if you look on the simulator on the left, if I swipe enough, it locks into place at certain points. And this anchor is going to help us define where we should lock at. Next, we have three different constants and computer properties. The first is a constant called screen width, which I just take from UI screen. And the reason we need screen width is because these next two computer properties depend on screen width to define their values. The first is anchor width, which is a CG float, and it's going to be the value of screen width divided by 3. Anchor width refers to the width of either the left or the right content, and the reason it's called anchor width is because that's also how much we need to swipe to display the left or right content. Then we have a variable called swipe threshold, which is also a CG float, and it's going to be a 15th of screen width. The swipe threshold is just how much we need to swipe in order to lock into place at a certain point, And I made it pretty sensitive here, so a 15th of screen width, but you can change the denominator of this fraction if you want a more or less sensitive swipe. The last two variables are booleans called right passed and left passed. They are just indicating, have we passed that swipe threshold that we have defined for either side. Now that we have all these variables, we can go ahead and use them in our DragGesture computed property. Our DragGesture has two modifiers that we care about, which are onChanged and onEnded. Let's start with onEnded. We know that we want to see if we have passed the threshold or not whenever we lift our finger from the swipe item. And that's going to change what the value of anchor is. So let's say, so we know right pass means that we have passed the right threshold. So if right passed, then we want to set the anchor to negative anchor width. And remember, the anchor just represents the starting point for h offset. We set it to negative anchor width because, as you can see on the right, if we pass the right threshold, that means we're swiping left. So it's going to be a negative anchor width, and this anchor width represents the size of this right content here. On the other hand, if we're left pass, then we want to do the opposite. We want to set anchor to anchor width, but it's positive because we're swiping to the right. So now it's positive. Lastly, if we haven't passed any threshold, then we should just set anchor to 0. And then at the end of our onEnded closure, we should set h offset to anchor because it's the starting place for h offset. Let's go ahead and fill out our onChanged modifier now. So we know that we want to change the h offset based on how much we dragged. And the value of how much we dragged is determined by this parameter here, value translation. So the parameter is value, but we take the translation.width property of it, and we go ahead and set h offset to that value. But the issue is, this is relative to the starting point. So it doesn't tell us anything about where we started with our swipe, it just tells us how far have we gone from where we started. So we need to add our anchor here because we're starting at different points if we locked at a different place. Now the logic to change left pass and right pass and to determine whether we pass the left threshold or right threshold or not is a little complicated, so I'll just paste it here. You can try to take a look at that and understand, but all it's doing is testing whether we're passing the left or the right threshold and then setting left pass and right pass accordingly. And it does change based on if anchor is greater than 0 or if anchor is less than 0. Because we can't depend on left pass as the condition to test to see if we're at an anchor right now. So it's a little confusing, but you can just copy this code from the GitHub, and I'll leave a more detailed explanation later in the description. Let's go ahead and add a few modifiers to our body so that we can actually use the swipe item, right? So we need to make sure we have our offset set. So this is going to be h offset, right? Our h stack is going to be offset by however much we decided in the logic of this drag gesture. Next, we want to set our frame to the max height to item height, which we defined above in our initializer. We also want to add a dot content shape of rectangle because in case there's empty space inside of the middle content, we want that still to be able to be dragged. And finally, let's add a clipped modifier. Let's go ahead and place an example in content view now so that we can test out our code. So I have a small example here that I've made, and you can just copy this down. But all it is just a few colored rectangles on the left and right with some SF symbols and then some text in the middle. It's nothing too complicated. Let me paste this here. Okay, let's go ahead and run it and see how it looks so far. So as you can see, we have problems immediately. And the reason is because we forgot to set the size of each content. The size is very specific. Our middle content should always take up the width of the entire container that it is in, which means we need to use a geometry reader. So I'm going to wrap our HStack in a geometry reader and set the width of content to the entire container width. Then we also want to make sure that we're using the anchor width variable, which is how big the left and right content should be. So let's set the left content width to be anchor width, and do the same for the right one. Now let's go ahead and run it and see how that looks. Now we're going to encounter another problem here, because on the left we have our left content showing right when we get in, but that's not what we want, right? We want it to be hidden when we get in. And the reason this is happening is because the left is the very start of the HStack, which means it's pushing everything else to the right. So we need to account for this inside of our offset, or H offset here, and add negative anchor width to it, which will correctly displace the left content out of the screen. And now if we run it, you can see that we can swipe left or right, but it's a little jagged. It doesn't really move smoothly. And the reason is because we want to add a with animation modifier here. It will just animate all the changes to H offset, which will make it look a lot smoother and more akin to the actual swipe animations in most apps. So now if we go ahead and run it, as you can see, it's really smooth and it looks great. One last issue. We dragged too much, and now we can see that the swipe item has ended and there's no more content. It's going farther than we have allocated for the size of the right content and the left content as well. We need to add a block instead of onChanged in order to prevent the user from dragging too much. And this block is going to look like this. So if the absolute value of H offset is greater than the anchor width, which means we somehow swiped past the left or the right too far, then if we are at the left anchor, we want to set the H offset equal to anchor width, which accordingly sets it back to the maximum, so it can't go past that anymore. And on the other side, for right pass, we set it to negative anchor width. And with that, it should be completely finished. So this is our swipe item. As you can see, we can swipe to the right or left, and you can make these buttons clickable, interactable, and whatever you want to do with them. But this is a swipe item inside of SwiftUI.